Noam Chomsky, one of the greatest, if not the greatest linguist of all times, started his career in the 1950s. He claimed that children do not learn their first language, but rather form it spontaneously, like their bodies form other biologically conditioned systems while maturing. According to Chomsky, there is a genetically inherited linguistic module in a human brain. Chomsky called this module language acquisition device. In childhood, during what is called a critical period, a window of opportunity gets opened for this device to get activated. During the critical period, the linguistic module receives stimulation. The child hears a natural language spoken around. Once the module gets activated by this stimulation, the child constructs the necessary grammar of a given language very quickly. Language is therefore like other biological systems, for example, like vision. If one is brought up in total darkness, he will never develop a properly functioning visual system. But if a child is exposed to light during critical period, the system gets triggered and builds up the necessary capability. Chomsky wants to say that language is already present in the brain of a newborn, like this bud of the vision system. It would be more correct to compare the language bud to a Lego construction set. This set has a number of simple principles, according to which many different figures can be assembled from its blocks. All natural languages operate according to these basic principles. Chomsky called the sum of them universal grammar. Natural languages differ only in the concrete ways in which the principles of the universal grammar get realized. In their time, all these claims caused a big sensation. Does the principles of the universal grammar condition human cognition? Can we penetrate the depths of the human mind by studying syntactic universals? How does the language device in our brain interact with our reasoning, with our feelings, with our moral and ethical judgments? All these questions are very exciting. Chomsky followed in the steps of philosophers Descartes and Kant, who postulated that human mind possesses capacities, helping it to frame reality in a specifically human way. These capacities do not belong to reality, but are applied to it. The mind ensures human individuality, creativity and rationality, and ultimately, conditions our free will. It is a noble thought, but it has one nasty downside. If the mind is not conditioned by reality, but, on the contrary, conditions reality, the mind must be exogenous to it. In other words, it must interact with reality from some space beyond it. For Chomsky, that posed a big problem. It was difficult for him, being a scientist, to admit that the universal grammar in the human brain had a metaphysical source. It was equally difficult for him to say that the language acquisition device was formed during a long evolutionary process by slow incremental accumulation of various features necessary for the language to emerge. Even if language is a biological device, it is such a peculiar phenomenon, so surprisingly unique to humans, that it is hard to amount human speech faculty to a combination of animal systems, even in a new configuration. Imagine you cook a vegetable soup, and you use only water and vegetables, but in the end, you discover that there is a piece of kangaroo meat in the soup. Of course, you can always recur to the argument of the emergent properties, but let us be real, there is a limit to that. Did we miss the moment when someone put a piece of kangaroo meat in the pot? For a long time, Chomsky was reluctant to address the question of language origin, declaring the problem wrongly formulated. What was important was to describe the workings of the universal grammar, to create its convincing abstract theory. For a period of time, though, Chomsky insisted on a very special, non-linear event in the human evolution that added a missing link to the language module in the human brain. Otherwise, he kept furthering degrees of sophistication in his abstract theory of language universals, sometimes, as his opponents claimed, contradicting what he had said before. Universal grammar became transformational generative grammar. There were now a surface structure and a deep structure. There was to be a distinction between the competence and the performance, in other words, between the inner knowledge of language and its practical use. There were external and internal languages, and so on. But mainly, he continued to cling to the notion of the perfect syntax, the idea that an internal syntactic matrix was a stable given of a human thought. For him, syntax was a universal human cognitive mechanism employed to structure thoughts, a sort of a booster for thought process, rather than a technical means to form verbal messages in order to communicate with them. Language in this paradigm is just a side effect of a thought matrix. It is worth saying that Chomsky's ideas were largely inspired by the school of the evolutionary development in biology. The representatives of this school suggest that all living species on Earth have the same genome. The mutations in the regulatory genes in this genome lead to different expressions in the other group of genes, in the working genes that actually build the individual's body. And so it is not so much the genome that is different in different living organisms, but the way it gets expressed in them. The idea is exactly the same in Chomskian linguistics. The universal grammar is common for all humans, natural languages are just different ways of expressing this universal grammar. Eventually, Chomsky came up with a totally new view on the whole thing, a so-called minimalist program. In it he tried to derive as many features of the language as possible, from the general properties of cognition and from laws of nature. In other words, syntax forms its rules on the basis of the speech production physical constraints, taking into account memory limitations, the way the perceptual apparatus forms representations, and so on. There was a rather ingenious explanation for the whole thing, the so-called third factor. Humans, like many other animals, possess a sensory-motor system and a conceptual-intentional system. Sensory-motor system allows an individual to perceive reality and to react to it physically, for example, to form sounds. Conceptual-intentional system helps to evaluate what is perceived, to categorize it, and then choose a proper reaction to the event. There is an interface between the two, also in animals. What Chomsky claims is that in contrast to animals, in humans this interface got suddenly boosted by a certain computational module which interposed between the sensory-motor system and a conceptual-intentional system. This computational module began to form reactions to reality in a very effective way. The main innovation was recursive thought. It was a possibility to reflect on reality, to dig deeper into it. For example, with a capability to form recursive thoughts, an individual could now think. He does not know that I know, that he hid from the tribe a part of the mammoth that we killed yesterday. The same module calculated many ways in which general universal principles of the thought language could be externalized, creating speech. In this, they followed the least effort principle, adapting to physical constraints of sound production. In his later works, Chomsky agreed that the larger part of the language faculty, formed during the evolution, and constitutes an interaction of many biological features and systems, also present in animals. But he defines recursion as the core of the human speech faculty, as being exclusively human way of structuring thoughts. He calls it language faculty in the narrow sense. Now then, a question arises, how did recursion emerge in the human brain if it is not present in animals? Chomsky suggests that it may have been some ancient biological module which in humans was put to a new use, for example, a navigation module similar to the one that migratory birds have. He suggests it could have happened following a mutation. Recursion then became the core feature of the thought language, leading to symbolic thinking. What can be said? It appears a little bit too neat, doesn't it? Why nothing similar happened to any other animal species in all the history of the evolution? Many animal species even today possess the necessary basic systems to develop language and symbolic thinking, but they seem stubbornly abstaining from taking this route. Let us now summarize Chomsky's main ideas and see if they can give us a satisfying answer to the question that we are asking, namely, what is language? As we see, for Chomsky, language is a side product of an essential, innate and unchanging property of a human brain, namely of its recursive syntactic module that contains universal grammar. Chomsky compares the universal grammar to a snowflake, ideally structured by the influences of various natural constraints. He says that none of the words in language refer to external entities, words are rather mental tools that we use to think about the world. Words do not name things, they just help us to find our way among things, boosting our rational capacities. What can be said? First, Chomsky's stance becomes dangerously close to the position of his opponents, who claim that there are no linguistic universals in the brain, only general learning mechanisms. The second point to be made is this. If the universal grammar resulted from the adaptational needs, then its mechanism cannot be universal and unchangeable. Culture is the environmental niche for the human species. This niche changes much more rapidly than the climate or other factors of the natural environment. The system of linguistic structures must be perceptive to these changes and adapt to them quickly. It has to do it in much less time than it takes other biological systems to adapt to the changes in the external conditions. For example, it is okay for the vision to take long time to adapt to the changing lighting conditions on Earth, as these changes themselves develop slowly. But language should react to its fast-changing environment every day. In this paradigm, the system of the universal grammar, if it exists, should be viewed, if not as a waste yard of linguistic structures accumulated over time, then at least as a building that has to be dismantled very often, so that some of its parts can be used for the construction of a new building. Natural languages may pick up from these old structures what they need, sometimes, indeed, very similar structural principles. But sometimes, they may do with very little of the old material. In yet other cases, they may put parts of the old structures to very peculiar individual uses. But should we so thoroughly rejoice if we detect in several medieval buildings ancient columns of Ionic order, and conclude from this fact that such columns are indispensable for buildings in general, and that all modern buildings should necessarily have them? It would be strange if we say that many of the various support structures in the modern buildings are disguised ancient Ionic columns. The thing is, there may not be any underlying, essential, eternal cognitive structure underpinning language, but a range of inherited mental paths, formed in the species by the previous usage of language and subject to relatively quick change. These paths are used creatively and opportunistically in different languages, and avoided altogether when they are not needed. Language in all its entirety may then be viewed as a protean organism where the competence is influencing performance, and vice versa. Here is another metaphor to highlight the potential controversy in the concept of the universal grammar. It is easy to fall into an illusion that the banks of a river command the river's flow. We may try to establish how the river's characteristics, in each of its segments, are determined by several changing factors in the structure of the relief of its banks. But is there such a big point in doing this analysis? The river flow, its bed and its banks are function of the gravitation, the climate, and the geology. They change together under the influence of this environment, not because the banks of the river constrain and condition the river's flow. The Chomskyan approach to language successfully tackles many questions about and around language. For example, it resolves the problem of the first language acquisition by children, proclaiming inheritance of some workable mental paths along which a child can start learning a natural language. But the connection between the intricate, even sometimes arcane, system of transformational syntactic rules with the events in the natural languages does not seem convincing. Whether these rules are universal and indispensable, or they are opportunistically used old solutions, passed on epigenetically as certain inherited neuronal paths, remains a question. Chomsky's suggestions that language and symbolic thinking resulted from a mutation, or from a reuse of an ancient biological module, are not satisfactory either. No explanations for the need of such mutation, or for the recycling of an ancient module, are provided. It seems to be taken for granted that language boosted cognition, and that the combination ensured an unprecedented competitive advantage to the human species. But as we will see later, language and symbolic thinking, by all means, should have been rather a problem for the proto-humans in the beginning, than an advantage. So, why did they adopt it, and how did they survive with it? We will address these issues in our main course.